So, you've decided to grow a garden this year. That's fantastic. You're my kind of people. And on top of that, you've decided to grow in a raised bed setup. Now we're talking. But whether you've made your own raised bed or you've simply purchased one, some of you may be left wondering, what now? How do you get from this to this when you've never done it before and you don't know where to start? Well, I've got you covered. Let's talk about setting up your first garden bed to save both time and money while ensuring that your harvest this summer are all that they can be. Let's get to it. As you know, and probably why you're here, gardening in a raised bed has distinct advantages. 7 in fact. And perhaps it's one or more of these advantages that has led you here and to raised bed gardening in the first place. Let's briefly touch on these 7 benefits before we get into the setup. Right away, we have portability. You know, with a traditional garden plot, you're limited to where there's usable, workable soil. Raised beds can literally be placed anywhere you want. Second, we have accessibility. Now, I don't know about you, but the days of toiling at ground level are over for me. Give me a nice raised bed to sit on and no chore seems insurmountable. 3, we have better drainage. No matter what the soil drainage capabilities are below the bed, we know that as long as we use the proper soil inside, we'll always have that perfect drainage. And as you get growing and get more and more crops under your belt, you really become to understand just how important drainage is. Coming in at number 4, we have better soil. Because we can fill the bed with whatever we want, generally raised beds have significantly better soil. We can fill, replace, amend, and change the contents of the bed quite easily. Certainly much easier than a traditional plot. And speaking of that soil, the stuff in a raised bed tends to warm up faster, much faster. And what that means for us gardeners is faster germination, faster growth, and a longer growing season. Huge advantage. At number 6, we see a little bit of pest control. Depending on your height and whether or not there's a lip on the top of your bed, you could see a decrease in things like slugs and snails, and other munchies that choose not to traverse the vertical plane. And lastly, self-contained raised beds have infinitely better weed control. Initially, we're filling these beds with weed-free, clean soil. So right there, we're ahead of the game. The tall sides of the bed also usually prevent things like grasses from creeping in at the edges. And from below, the raised bed simply smothers any weed activity coming up through the soil profile. Add those things up, and weeds just aren't really that big of a problem anymore. Okay, great. We've justified our reasoning for growing in raised beds 7 times over. But how do we go about placing and setting them up for growing success? The initial setup of any raised bed is divided into 3 parts: location, the placement, and of course the filling and planting. For location, some of you might not have a choice. You have a designated spot for the bed, and that's where it's gonna go. That's that. However, for those of you that have options, some locations are better than others. Nearly all of the crops you'll grow will want as much sun as you can give them. But being the needy things that they are, they're also going to enjoy protection from the winds. What this means is, if you live in the northern hemisphere, you're going to want to place your beds on the south side of any structures to avoid them being shaded out. And for the southern hemisphere, the opposite is true. As for east-west, I tend to choose west-facing beds for my warmer crops, as they get the afternoon sun and the hottest parts of the day. While cooler crops like peas and beets and carrots, I'll grow along the east-facing fences so that they can enjoy the morning sunshine and get a break later on in the day. And for those freestanding beds, there doesn't seem to be any appreciable difference, for lying them north-south or east-west. So just put them in a location where they get the most sun. Great, we now know where to put the bed. Hopefully in your garden, you got a good spot available. Now, you want to make sure that the area is clear, flat, and accessible. This area is none of those things. Hang on a bit while I get it prepped. Clear the area of weeds for your new garden bed as much as you can. And if possible, lay down a weed barrier and cover it with a suppressing mulch like wood chips or gravel. You know, 98% of your weeds are going to originate from the areas around your bed. Garden beds are heavy, especially the big ones. And if you have more willing buddies than I do, get a hand to help you place them. While leveling the beds isn't that important to how well the plants are actually going to grow inside, any discrepancy in evenness will be greatly exaggerated over time. So trust me when I suggest, get them as even and level as possible when you initially place them. All right, we're all set up in a prime west-facing location. Let's get these guys all filled up and start planting, right? Well, sort of. If you ever had to fill large garden beds or multiple garden beds with topsoil, you know that it can get quite expensive. That's fine if you have your own compost and enough of it to fill up the bulk of the volume of the beds, but filling those guys up with just topsoil that you have to buy can often exceed the cost of the beds themselves. Thankfully, there's an inexpensive solution that many veteran gardeners use but rarely talk about. To demonstrate, let's look at the vertical profile of a typical garden bed in thirds. By dividing these beds up into a top, middle, and bottom layer, I'll show you how I fill these guys up on the cheap and still get the same growing success. First, that initial bottom layer, it's filled up with mostly yard waste and raw materials. Things like branches, twigs, leaves, even grass clippings. Hey, you could even use raw kitchen scraps. Almost all organic matter is on the menu. Next up, that middle layer is reserved for soil, but not necessarily the top quality garden soil that we're used to. So, things like spent pots, older potting mixes, things like that. Once the first two layers are down, I'll throw on a barrier layer like cardboard, or in this case brown craft paper, right on top. You never know if that second layer of old soil is hiding any weed seeds. Finally, we get to that third layer, and that's going to be your fine topsoils and your quality organic potting mixes. This is what our new plants or seeds are going to be getting planted into. So you really want this stuff to be the premium quality. But because we're only filling 25 to 30% of the bed with it, that's where our huge cost savings comes in. By the time the roots of your crops reach down past that top layer, those first two layers are going to be decomposed and are going to turn into a great subsoil layer. Topsoil is great, but it doesn't need to be your entire bed. If your entire bed needed to be topsoil, then we'd need to dig out our raised beds every year because the topsoil turns into subsurface soil within a season. As for how far to fill up the beds initially, well, that depends. I fill right to the top if I'm going to be direct seeding that bed right away. But if I'm going to be using pre-made starter plants, I've got the option to either fill it to the top and then dig holes for those starter plants, or fill it to within about 6 inches of the top and then plant those starter plants in. Really, that kind of planting is personal preference, and I usually take it on a plant by plant basis. If you're new to the world of gardening this year, welcome. I wish you all the success. And if you've chosen to grow in raised beds like I have, I might be a little bit biased, but I think you made the right choice. But for now, I got a few hundred more of these guys to plant out this afternoon. Hey, be sure to hit that subscribe button as we're going to be talking about raised bed gardening tips all spring and summer. And hey, if you're still in the planting stages of your garden and you want to build your own raised garden bed right from scratch, but you're looking for designs and you don't really know how to do it, check out this video I did here. It walks you through every step of the way.